Welcome, everyone. I want to thank you all for coming today. This is our guest speaker, Richard Piccarreto, and he is a Stow resident. He's with the Thoreau Society, and he's going to give us some information today. And we are going to turn the mic over to you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Jane. And this program is actually sponsored by Mass Humanities and the Mass Cultural Council. That's who actually is paid for me to be here today. And I also want to give thanks to the Concord Free Library. Their Special Collections Department has allowed me to use some of the images that they hold in their collection in today's presentation. I want to let you know that I'm here on behalf of the Thoreau Society. ThoreauSociety.org is our website. We're out of Concord, Massachusetts, from the old Thoreau farm on Virginia Road, which is where Henry was born. And the Thoreau Society is the oldest and largest organization dedicated to an American author, started in 1941. We have members from all 50 states and from 20 different nations around the world, including the Penobscot Nation in Maine. And the Thoreau Society exists to stimulate interest in and foster education about Thoreau's life, works, legacy, and his place in his world and ours, challenging all to live a deliberate, considered life. Mr. Thoreau dined with us yesterday. He is a singular character, a young man with much of wild, original nature still remaining in him. And so far as he is sophisticated, it is in a way and method of his own. He is ugly as sin, long-nosed, queer-mouthed, with uncouth and rustic, though courteous manners. Corresponding very well with such an exterior. But his ugliness is of an honest and agreeable fashion, and becomes him much better than beauty. He was educated, I believe, at Cambridge, and formerly kept school in this town, but for 2 or 3 years back, he has repudiated all regular modes of getting a living, and seems inclined to lead a sort of Indian life among civilized men. An Indian life, I mean, as respects the absence of any systemic effort for a livelihood. He has been for some time an intimate of Mr. Emerson's family, and in requital he labors in the garden and performs such other offices as may suit him, being entertained by Mr. Emerson for the sake of what true manhood there is in him. Mr. Thoreau is a keen and delicate observer of nature, a genuine observer, which I suspect is almost as rare a character as even an original poet. And nature, in return for his love, seems to adopt him as her special child, and shows him secrets which few others are allowed to witness. He is familiar with beast, fish, fowl, and reptile, and has strange stories to tell of adventures and friendly passages with these lower brothers of mortality. Herb and flower, likewise, wherever they grow, whether in garden or wildwood, are his familiar friends. He is also on intimate terms with the clouds, and can tell the portents of storms. It is a characteristic trait that he has a great regard for the memory of the Indian tribes, whose wild life would have suited him so well, and strange to say, he seldom walks over a plowed field without picking up an arrow point, spearhead, or other relic of the red men, as if their spirits willed him to be the inheritor of their simple wealth. That was from Nathaniel Hawthorne, September 1, 1842. He's just met Henry Thoreau, and has invited him over for dinner at the Old Manse in Concord, which you can still visit today as a historic home. If a man does not keep pace with his companions, perhaps it is because he hears a different drummer. Let him step away to the music which he hears, however measured or far away. I want to not just lecture to you today. I want to ask, what do we know about Henry Thoreau in this group? Anyone read Walden or Cape Cod or any input? I want to start a conversation rather than just sort of lecture for 15 minutes, but I can lecture for 15 minutes, and then you can have some questions at the end if you'd like to do it that way. And if anywhere along the way during this you have a question, just throw up your hand. Don't be shy. Henry's a really interesting character. He is one of those people that was sort of born kind of on the outside looking in. He's a great observer. He's a bit stern. But any thoughts on even just kind of if someone throws that word out there? Yes?
Well, I know he's an abolitionist.
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 Yes.
And he lived in a hut right on a building.
Yes, absolutely. I'll talk a little bit about that today. And part of why I'm here in the Thoreau Society, sort of supporting Henry, is that Henry's been picked on and misunderstood over the generations. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And as I kind of go through his life and kind of bring in, and here we have the man who's had him over for dinner is actually having a pretty good time picking him apart as well, in Nathaniel Hawthorne. Henry's born on Virginia Road in Concord, July 12th, 1817. And this is a home that you can still visit on weekends. This is a museum home, Thoreau Farm. And he is... Here we have three of the primary images. We don't have a lot of images of Henry. We have a crayon sketch from 1854. We have a photograph from 1856 and another photograph from 1860. And Henry's suffering from tuberculosis. And so by the time we're looking at 1860 here, he's going to die in 1862. And so you can see here, he's in worse health. But he has a sister, Helen, who is about 5 years older than he is. He's got a brother, John, who's a couple of years older, 3 years older than he is. And he has a sister, Sophia, who is 2 years behind him. Sophia will be the executor of all of Henry's writings. Henry dies in the middle of the Civil War in 1862 at 44 years old. He's had a couple of books published at that point, but the vast majority of his notebooks and his science writings went unpublished until his sister actually followed up and organized the publishing of that. So we're grateful to her because we wouldn't have his work if it weren't for her efforts after Henry's death. John Thoreau, his father, and Cynthia. John is, and we have to understand sort of what's happening in the 1820s into the 30s into the 40s is we're moving from the agrarian to an industrialized Massachusetts here. And so John is working that farm out on Virginia Road. It's actually an inherited rental in a way of his wife's family. But at the same time, he decides he's going to open a store in Concord. He's going to walk 2 miles every day from his farm to the store in Concord while he's trying to run the farm. And eventually, he's going to make his way more into the mercantile world. And when Cynthia's brother up in New Hampshire finds a vein of what's called plumbago, which is a graphite material, they decide to go into the pencil business. And the Thoreau family is known for its high-quality pencils. Henry Thoreau himself would help his father in this business on and off again, and they're an innovative pencil manufacturer in Concord at the time. This is the ground plumbago or graphite is going to be mixed with clay, baked, and then the cedar pencils built around these rods. The number 1, 2, 3, 4 pencils, the grades of pencil that we know today come from the Thoreaus, and actually that number 2 pencil that we most normally use in school actually is based on this earlier set of graded pencils, some for carpenters, some for drafters, some for students, this kind of thing. So that goes back to that time. Henry's family is very politically active. His sisters and his mother are early followers of William Lloyd Garrison, and he is the Boston printer who is a staunch abolitionist in the early 1830s. He is going to put together the newspaper called The Liberator, and he is calling for the absolute freedom of all enslaved people with no recompense to their owners. This is a radical idea in the 1830s, and everybody, including churches, considers this to be very shrill and very kind of a way off the beaten path. But it'll be the women in Concord, the Women's Anti-Slavery Society in 1837, that comes together that is at first somewhat marginalized and not taken very seriously, but later by the 1840s will be the fire that is really going to light that fire of abolition underneath Ralph Waldo Emerson and others in Concord. Ralph Waldo Emerson has kind of an arc up to actually getting to be an outspoken public abolitionist. Henry, though, because of his sisters and his mother, he's pretty unequivocal throughout his life. It's pretty impressive in his time that he's for straight across the board equal rights and freedom for all. Henry is known as a very serious child. They called him the judge when he was a little boy, and he is going to eventually end up at Harvard as a teen. Now, he's born David Henry Thoreau, and he will change his name when he goes to Harvard. He's going to go to Harvard from 16 to 20 years old in 1833 to 37. It was actually common for boys to go to Harvard 14 to 18 years old. Henry's just a couple of years beyond that at that point, but it was kind of more like the high school years. Henry's first taste of living in a cabin, which he'll eventually do famously at Walden, is with one of his friends, Charles Stearns Wheeler, who, after graduating from Harvard, they actually spend a well-deserved part of the summer on Flint's Pond in Lincoln Concord line, and the Wheeler Thoreau cabin is depicted here that they stayed in. Now, 1837, when Henry gets out of Harvard, we have our first economic crisis in American history, our first serious one anyway, the Panic of 1837. We have a lot of overextended lending. We have 40% of American banks go out of business. This is a very rough time to have been graduating from college. And luckily, Henry is picked up as a school teacher by the town of Concord, and he's hired to teach 90 students. He's going to get paid $500 a year, and he's going to be teaching today. This is the Masonic Hall, and this goes back to the early 1820s. Actually, this Masonic Hall was founded by Paul Revere, and in the late 1790s. And on the first floor of this building, Henry will be teaching school when he returns to Concord after college. And a couple of weeks into his teaching career, the local administrator for the school comes in to review how Henry is doing and notices that he is not hitting the children. And he pulls him aside and says, "Henry, you need to hit the children with the fair rule. This is an integral part of education." And Henry says, "I do not need to hit the children in order to educate them. I can discipline them in other ways." He says, No, Henry, you need to demonstrate for me right now, actually. Grab two of the kids, show me how you're going to use this fair rule, which is a stick to hit them on the hand and punish them for bad behavior. Henry is mortified. He has to grab two children who are absolutely innocent of anything, smack them both on the hand, send them off crying, and that night he takes his keys and says to the administrator, "I'm done as a teacher here." And so, in the midst of a financial crisis due to very strict principle, Henry has a 2-week career as a teacher, and off he goes. He's going to go back to pencil making with his father. Henry will eventually have some teaching stints in Canton, and then briefly, and then he'll actually put a school together with his brother, and they'll run a preparatory school for a brief time. But as he goes back to his house in Concord, there are numerous homes in Concord that the Thoreaus live in during this time. There's a boarder at the Thoreau house. His mother has boarders, and she happens to be Ralph Waldo Emerson's sister-in-law, Lucy Jackson, and she is quite taken with young Henry, and she brings him over to meet Ralph Waldo Emerson. Ralph Waldo Emerson is our father of American transcendentalist thought. He is now this rising star in the public Lyceum lecture circuit. He is going around on the new train lines throughout young America and lecturing at your Mechanics Hall, your Grange Hall, and he is a former minister. He has left the church for a number of reasons, and he was a 7th generation Harvard trained minister at the time. His book Nature is going to be quite controversial. It insists on us having a direct relationship with God, with no particular church, no particular savior, no particular third parties as the intermediaries, that we have a direct, holistic relationship with God. This is quite controversial for a former minister to be writing in 1836. And Emerson's general idea is that there is this holistic nature to everything, that nothing is separate from anything else, basically, and that man has the potential for a divine relationship with God, not just Jesus, not just a saint or a priest or this kind of person, that all of us have the potential for divine relationship with God, and that nature is our path to knowing that divinity with God. This is going to be both controversial and very inspiring to a number of people, and again, the cornerstone text to American Transcendentalist thought. I'm going to read a little bit about a very strict definition. Transcendentalism, a 19th century movement of writers and philosophers in New England who were loosely bound together by adherence to an idealistic system of thought based on a belief in the essential unity of all creation, that I was just mentioning, the innate goodness of humanity, and the supremacy of insight over logic and experience for the revelation of the deepest truths. This comes out of German Transcendentalism, Goethe and Kant, etc. And then it was refracted, great word, by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Thomas Carlyle, and others in England. And Indian and Chinese scriptures are also a part of all the influence. There's a world influence that comes together here in Concord for this. These were the sources to which the New England Transcendentalists turned in their search for a liberating philosophy. Transcendentalism focuses on the human spirit realizing truth, justice, and beauty first through the intuitive and reasoned mind, and then positing facts. Thoreau writes of building castles in the air and then putting foundations under them. Transcendentalism's emphasis on conversation rests on the Socratic method of dialogue, argument, and inquiry that Thoreau, Emerson, and others in their orbit employed in both private parlors and public lectures alike. This is the Emerson house where actually Henry will really bond with Ralph Waldo Emerson. Emerson opens his library to Henry. Henry's getting all kinds of European translations of Indian writing, of Chinese writing, whatever is coming into the Emerson household. And Henry will eventually be invited to actually live at the Emerson house as the handyman and the gardener for Ralph Waldo Emerson. And he has a couple of different stints where he stays actually at the Thoreau house, the Emerson house. Henry Thoreau is a very super sensitive and kind of a malleable person. He is so sensitive that he has this kind of edgy, kind of contrarian edge to him. He can be oppositional, kind of naturally. He's kind of a bit scowling, like I said, kind of judgmental. But he's incredibly sensitive. And when he meets Ralph Waldo Emerson, he's so taken with Ralph Waldo Emerson that he starts to walk and talk like Ralph Waldo Emerson. And lots of people sort of call him out on this and say, you know, Henry is turned into Ralph Waldo Emerson. And we have James Russell Lowell here, who really takes a stab at Henry. There comes Thoreau, for instance, to see him's rare sport, tread in Emerson's tracks with legs painfully short. How he jumps, how he strains and gets red in the face, to keep step with the mystagogue's natural pace. What a word, the mystagogue. Mm-hmm. He follows as close as a stick to a rocket, his fingers exploring the prophet's each pocket. Fie for shame, brother Bard, with good fruit of your own, can't you let neighbor Emerson's orchards alone? So this is one of the first takes at Henry from the publisher of what will become the Atlantic magazine. He's also a writer and publisher himself, James Russell Lowell. And so there's a very deep relationship that forms between Thoreau and Emerson. And from Henry's side, a deep love, and to the point where he can be a little bit overbearing with Ralph Waldo. Ralph Waldo has to kind of keep him at arm's length a little bit. And there's a great book by Jeffrey Kramer, who runs the Walden Institute Library, called Solid Season. And if you're interested in the letters back and forth and the correspondence and their diary entries and this kind of thing about each other, this is a great book that I highly recommend. We went through that. Henry, some will argue that Ralph Waldo Emerson was the Obi-Wan Kenobi to Henry, our young Jedi transcendentalist. But I would say that Ralph Waldo is Han Solo. and that the real Obi-Wan Kenobi is this elder farmer and hunter named George Minot, who lived up on a hill above Emerson's house. This house is now long on this big yellow mansion in Concord, if you go down Lexington Road and see this. But Henry, in his journals, he has a vast set of journals where he was writing from 1837 when he met Emerson. Emerson said to him, "What are you doing? Are you keeping a journal?" And Emerson said, "No, but I am starting right now." And so he starts writing every day. This will go till 1861, right when he's on the verge of death. And there's a 2 million word set of Thoreau's journals, which really give you all of his observations daily, this kind of thing. And throughout it, one of the most mentioned people is George Minot. It's this old timer who's hanging out at his house with his chickens and his cats, and he has been this very private and sort of secluded farmer. He lives with his sister up on the hill here, and Henry has numerous entries where he goes, he just hangs out with the old man. He wants to get the old stories, he wants to hear about hunting, he wants to know about the seasons, when are the geese coming, when are these blooming, this kind of thing. And this old timer, he knows everything about everything, and he keeps this meticulous farm. And he writes about George that Minot is perhaps the most poetical farmer who most realizes to me the poetry of the farm's life that I know. He does nothing with haste or drudgery, but as if he loved it. All of his work he's very deliberate about. He makes the most of his labor and takes infinite satisfaction in every part of it. He's not looking forward to the sale of his crops or any pecuniary profit, but he is paid by the constant satisfaction which his labor yields him. He has not too much land to trouble him, or too much work to do, no hired man or boy, but simply to amuse himself and live. He cares not so much to raise a large crop as to do his work well. He knows every pin and nail in his barn. If another linter is to be floored, he lets no hired man rob him of that amusement, but he goes slowly to the woods at his leisure, selects a pitch pine tree, cuts it, hauls it, or gets it hauled to the mill, and so he knows the history of every part of his barn floor. Farming is an amusement which has lasted him longer than gunning or fishing. He is never in a hurry to get his garden planted, and yet it is always planted soon enough, and none in the town is kept so beautifully clean. There is a Boston painter named Enoch Perry who painted this image, and this is not Henry Thoreau and George Minot, but it is in my mind. This is exactly how I picture this going, where Henry didn't smoke a pipe either, but I can just see Henry sitting with old man Minot. Old man Minot's got the old shirts on from the 18th century, and this very much kind of looks like Henry in a way as well. With the tough gray slacks that Henry would wear to be going out to the woods and all that all the time, and kind of getting all the wisdom from the old man. So this is something I like to just kind of show, kind of in the mind's eye. They both love cats, and they have a conversation where George says, "I wouldn't kill a cat for $20," and Henry says, "I wouldn't kill a cat for $50," and he says, "I wouldn't kill a cat for $100. I wouldn't kill a cat for $500. And so they go back and forth. They love cats, and Minot has cats kind of walking around him with his chickens. He's there, and he knows everything about everything. And he leans over to Henry and he says, it's in April one time, he says, "I heard a goose the other night. One call of a goose." And Henry says, "The goose aren't here yet." He says, "Old man Minot must be losing it." He said, "He's been 100% on everything he's ever told me. And how can he be so mistaken that there's a goose that has come by? They're not here yet. It's too early." And then Henry realizes there was a shipment of a box of geese that came into town and went to the local tavern and came by in front of Minot's house. And Minot heard the one goose, call, and then he goes, he goes, he's redeemed. He says, he's still 100%. He's absolutely 100%. Because Minot just says, "Yeah, I heard a goose the other night. I heard one of the calls." And so Henry has to put two and two together and says, okay, he hasn't gone soft yet. By 1839, Henry and his brother John build their own boat, a boat of about this size, and they name it the Misconceptions, which is what the native Nipmuc, Massachusetts descendants and Pennacook and the people of the area of Concord River and where the Assabet and the Sudbury come together, called Musketaquid. That whole area is called Musketaquid over there by them, where the river runs slowly through the grass. They named their boat Musketaquid. And he and his brother go up the Concord and Merrimack, and they take a 2-week trip. They end up in New Hampshire, they go hike around a bit, and then they come back down to town. And Henry writes about this, and this will be condensed into a week on the Concord and Merrimack. And this is what actually Henry will take from his journals and start to work on when he's at Walden. This boat will eventually be sold to Nathaniel Hawthorne at the Old Manse. In 1839, when they get back from the trip, John and Henry decide to open their own preparatory school for boys, and he's going to have a young summer visitor come named Edmund Sewell, and Edmund's about 12 or 13 years old, and he is summering with his family at the Thoreau house. Again, they have a boarding house, and he and Henry really bond. Not only is he teaching them in school, but they are hunting and fishing and swimming and hiking. And Henry has deep feelings for this young man. And he actually pours out into a poem that is quite passionate. It was called Sympathy. One part of it reads, "So I was taken unawares by this, I quite forgot my homage to confess. Yet now I'm forced to know, though hard it is, I might have loved him had I loved him less." Weeks later, his older sister, Ellen Sewell, comes and visits, and both Henry and John have known her growing up as a little girl. Now she's a young woman. And both John and Henry propose to Ellen. This is an interesting situation. Henry proposes to her by letter. She's from the South Shore, and her father will have none of these transcendentalists dating or being suitors to their daughter. He's a minister and conservative from the South Shore. But this is where, and there's a particular book here by Laura Dessau Walls, which I highly recommend if you're interested in Thoreau. This is a 2017 biography, which is the latest and greatest, and very, very well received, and a great read, a great listen to. It's on tape. And she has this great line. Laura writes in this book that in 1839, that was the year that Henry Thoreau fell in love twice. So between the feelings he has for her brother and Ellen, we have probably the beginning of a conflict in Henry, where Henry really decides not too long after this that he's going to be this solitary person, that he is not going to pair up with anybody. And it's a whole other topic that we could go down the road on, but he's going to be chaste, and he also has these ideas that he's ashamed of his body. And as much as he loves nature and reproduction and the cycles of continuance and all this kind of thing, it's kind of interesting that Henry goes into almost a monk kind of a state, and will sort of keep all of that at arm's length. And so there's a lot of speculation from people on kind of where that's coming from. I always talk about Henry as a holy man, but he's not religious. Holy can mean one, dedicated to God, a religious purpose, sacred. Two, I like a little bit better for Henry in terms of a definition, spiritually perfect or pure, untainted by evil or sin, sinless, saintly. And in Walden, and from the section in Walden called Higher Laws, Henry goes into a deep explanation about sensuality and how he kind of is keeping it at arm's length. So that's kind of a fundamental part to Henry that keeps us really guessing in deep conversation. Walden starts out pretty difficult. Did anyone read Walden while they were in high school or college? Was it ever assigned to you?
I did. A long time ago.
Years ago, right? And I remember as in the early 80s as a teenager, It was assigned to me in high school, and this is kind of a difficult read. People say, "Oh, it's one of the great books of all time," but the first chapter, called "Economy," is Henry getting really pecuniary. He's telling you he's building his cabin. He's paid 7 cents for these nails, but he should have paid 4 cents. And all this kind of stuff. So back and forth about every dime and every half penny and this and that and what everything costs and this and that. And it's obnoxious. You know, you're kind of like reading this. Oh my God, why am I reading this? This is page 2. I've traveled a good deal in Concord, and everywhere in shops and offices, fields, the inhabitants have appeared to me to be doing penance in 1,000 remarkable ways. I see young men, my townsmen, whose misfortune it is to have inherited farms, houses, barns, cattle, and farming tools. Wouldn't that be a good thing to inherit a farm, barns, and Henry says, "Oh no, this encumbers us. All this material stuff absolutely encumbers us." He says, "These are a lot more easily acquired than gotten rid of. Better if they had been born in the open pasture and suckled by a wolf," he writes, "that they have seen with clear eyes the field that they were called to labor in. Who made them serfs of the soil? Why should they eat their 60 acres when man is condemned to eat only 1 peck of dirt? Why should they begin digging their graves as soon as they are born?" So this is bleak stuff. This is page 2 of this book. And I remember as a teenager going, "Man, this is really obnoxious," especially when he gets into the money part of everything in economy. But what you come to realize is this is Henry holding a mirror up to us. We're the ones obsessed about every penny and money and material. And so he's getting in our face about this. He's kind of letting us know that 10 years before Ralph Waldo Emerson bought that beautiful big white house I showed you for $3,500, Henry has built his cabin on Walden Pond for $26 and change. And he's very much getting in our face about that. Now, by 1842 in January, we have a couple of tragedies that both befall Henry and Ralph Waldo Emerson. Henry loses his brother John to a brutal death of lockjaw, of a tetanus, from cutting his hand with his shaving razor. And his brother did not get this treated. The doctor, in retrospect, actually should have amputated his hand. And this gets infected with tetanus. And he is in absolute brutal, just kind of the worst deaths you could ever imagine. And Henry is with him to the end. He dies in his arms. And Henry is going to pick up in a psychosomatic way these symptoms that his brother had. And the poor family thinks that Henry might even die in short order. He's bedridden for weeks after this. His whole soul's just been shattered by the death of his brother. His brother was 27, John. And just a couple weeks prior to this, Ralph Waldo Emerson's 5-year-old first son, Waldo Jr., dies of scarlet fever. So this is a pretty dark month in Concord history over there in midwinter. And, you know, a lot of, when we talk about transcendental, what are we rising above in American transcendentalism? What are we rising above? We're rising above all kinds of things, kind of the status quo. We're rising above the idea of only particular types of relationships between peoples or the limits of love. We're talking about rising above the mere physical to the spiritual, and even death and the fear of death, that kind of a thing. And for Ralph Waldo Emerson, he loses his father when he's 8. He loses his sister when he's 14. He loses his first wife when she's 19 of tuberculosis. He loses 2 of his brothers of tuberculosis young, and his first son at 5. Ralph Waldo Emerson, up again, old heart, as he was. He is just, in terms of the resilience that Emerson has, this is something that I'm very inspired by these people, because the 19th century was incredibly rough, and so I can only imagine Henry as well, getting beyond that pain of loss of such a beloved brother at the time. Any of those types of losses can knock us out of our lives. Some people go right down into deep depression and never get out of it, can't recover from the death of a loved one, and this is just one after another in this century, without antibiotics and so on. 1844, I don't know, we all know of Henry as this naturalist. He's one of the first men that suggests that we start setting aside hundreds and hundreds of acres at a time as national parks, and he'll influence John Muir, who will influence Teddy Roosevelt will actually get this nationally to get our first national parks, this kind of thing. Henry's one of the first men that talks about that kind of thing. But I don't know if you knew that Henry actually started a forest fire with his friend Edmund Hoare. In 1844, they go fishing and they collect a bunch of fish, and it's a breezy day, and they build themselves an old, rotted out stump of a tree, a little fire that they're going to cook these fish on, and the wind takes it and it gets out of control, and they have to run to town out ahead of it and try and get people to come and fight this fire. This is an extraordinary situation, and what ends up happening is that Henry comes back and will even write that, hey, look how green this restored land is after the fire. He has this sort of positive take that the actual fire has done better for the land. But luckily, the person he starts the fire with is the son of the most venerable lawyer, Samuel Orr, in Concord. And so Edmund, his son, and Henry, I'm sure some checks were written. Somehow this was taken care of, so there's no criminal charges and there's no financial aspect to this. But we think of this father of American environmentalism starting a fire. 1844 is also when Samuel Hoare, the lawyer I was just telling you about, one of Massachusetts' top lawyers, goes down to South Carolina with his daughter to stop the impressment of black sailors rather, who are being taken off of Massachusetts ships and being held for ransom against their ship owners in shipping, and if not paid for, sold into slavery in South Carolina. And these two are run out of Charleston, South Carolina. There's a riot that starts around their hotel, and they never get to go to the Supreme Court of South Carolina and do this bidding that they're supposed to. When they come back to Concord, this begins very much this kind of north-south split. Concord is livid at the way that they were treated. And whereas we had slave pick cotton coming from down south and fueling the mills of West Concord and Lawrence and Lowell here at that time, nobody's really interested in questioning what's going on down south. Everybody wants this go, go, go economy up here in New England. This starts to fracture that north-south kind of collaboration and economy, and there are these second thoughts about really taking enslavement more seriously. And we have Frederick Douglass, who comes to Concord in 1844, and he'll be speaking August 1st on the 10th anniversary of the freedom of the West Indies. And Ralph Waldo Emerson will be speaking, Henry Thoreau will be speaking, and Frederick Douglass. We can only imagine the three of them sitting there and in turn all speaking at the townhouse in Concord that day. We don't have any record of the actual speeches, but this is the point at which Emerson really steps into the public and starts decrying enslavement at the time. There is prior an arrangement with the church to have this all happen at the church. Can you imagine the church wants nothing to do with this conversation about enslavement? This is a human rights issue, but it is such a hot topic that this is so controversial still at the time that the church wants nothing to do with it. So it has to go over to the townhouse, the town hall. And the agreement is that the bell is supposed to be rung to announce the beginning of this meeting. And the sexton at the church finally says to Henry, no, remember the church has nothing to do with this. We're not even going to ring the bell at the church to announce this event starting. And Henry basically pushes him aside and starts ringing the bell himself at the church to announce this meeting. And the bell itself, if you visit Concord, is removed from the First Parish Church after a 1900 fire that it had, and it's out on the front lawn. So if you happen to be in Concord and you see this bell, this is commemorating that moment that Henry took it upon himself to ring that bell to let people know that this meeting was going on. 1945, Henry is planning his stay on Walden Pond on a piece of Emerson's land. And what a lot of people don't understand is that Henry is not playing survivor. This is not to isolate himself and to try and test his ability to survive on sticks and grass and this kind of thing and make it through all kinds of weather. He's basically removing himself to the marginalized side of town. Walden, he's not alone out there. There are other people that live around Walden. There are formerly enslaved people that live around Walden. There are poor Irish railroad workers that are making their way out on the new Fitchburg line. Part of Henry's cabin is actually built by reclaimed wood from one of those cabins. It is not the forest even that it is today. It's been quite deforested at that time. and it's pretty wide open. It's really kind of hard to think about. We think of Henry sort of going and self-isolating out there, but he's not at all. He's just coming off of the credit-driven main street of the hustle and bustle of Concord, and he kind of wants to go out to this quiet place, and he wants time to sit down and write about his trip with his brother. And of course, he puts together his cabin, which a lot of people they sort of decried his isolationism. This was a roof raising with a number of people. This was a social event. He's not trying to be alone out there. And the cabin site is off right up here as you're visiting Walden. And the reproduction of his cabin is over here by the shop, if you happen to visit there. But what is out there is a cairn of stones and some stone pillars that show you where that was. This is an artist named John Rowan, who's a Massachusetts resident, who does these great drawings of Concord the way all of the evidence kind of tells us it looked in the 19th century. Very meticulous about where he's taking all of his references from and all his different writings. And you can see that Henry's cabin is kind of out in this is nothing the way this looks today. This is completely woods today. And so Henry is out here, but this has been, all the different families of Concord have used these forest chunks as their woodlots to bring their hardwood into Concord Center and to their homes, something that was required at the time for all the firewood that you needed. So this is a whole different landscape than today. You're looking basically where we're standing here is the railroad tracks that came out that were not too far from Henry's cabin, just at the west end of the pond. And during that time, Henry is taking meticulous notes along with writing his book A Week on the Concord and Merrimack. He is cataloging the flowering of every plant that he sees and every tree and every animal that he sees come out of hibernation, the weather each day, meticulous environmental records of what's going on. And Richard Premack, who is a professor at Boston University, is using Henry's data in detail, getting this transcribed and organizing all of this, and it is showing that we have spring 1 week earlier now in Massachusetts than we did in 1846. That's where we are right now. We're 1 full week earlier than we were at that time. And so in terms of global climate change and the regional climate change, Henry's data is actually being used right now. It was so wide-ranging and meticulous. By the 1850s, he's got these details. I looked to see how much the river has risen. The water's been steadily deepening on Concord meadows all night, rising with a dimple about every stem and bush. This is incredible detail, how you watch the water and what it looks like as it's coming up around those stems. And as it's arced a little bit, he's writing that there's that dimple. I woke this morning, I heard the forgotten sound of rain on the roof. I think it has not been any rain since Christmas Day, and it's April 3rd. That's kind of remarkable. Up the Assabet to the White Cedars, the river has risen again on account of the rain of the last 3 days, nearly the level of the 11th. I can just get over Hosmer's Meadow. He has all these incredibly meticulous, and the people, I give them credit. They're making sense of what this is and how this reads. And there's another professor who's coming down for an event here from Farmington, Maine, Kristen Case, she has a book coming out next year about this in detail, very specifically. We have an event each July around Henry's birthday, which is July 12th, the annual Thoreau Gathering. And people from around the world come to Concord, and we spend a week having symposiums and all different lectures and things and events all around Henry. And I encourage you to check out thoreausociety.org. You can take some information here after this if you're interested. The Saturday that we're going to do that, which is the 13th this year of July, is open to the public, so you don't have to pay the fee to come in and see some of the things that are going on there. And there's going to be a book sale at the end of that with a number of authors that will be signing the books as well at the end of that. While Henry's out there, he maps very specifically Walden Pond. And incredibly and really beautifully, Henry notes that at the narrowest point in the pond, where it dissects the longest part of the pond, is the deepest part of the pond. And Henry writes, that's where the human heart is on the human body. From our longest to our shortest point, that's where the human heart is. And so 102 feet deep, this is the longest, this is the deepest kettle pond in Massachusetts. This is quite a unique body of water, well cherished by the people that come and swim in it all year round. There's a group of people that swim this all winter, but really meticulous. So Henry has also studied up and purchased the materials to become a surveyor. And he's going to be one of Concord's best surveyors. So Henry doesn't have a particular profession, having coming out of Harvard. He is a little bit of everything. And he actually writes to his friends who all ask him to come to a reunion. What have you been doing? And like, what is your profession? And if I can find it here, Henry writes back to them. I can just find it here. Of course, if I can find it now. Okay, I have it. He gives them a list of the things that he is. Oh, I wish I did that in a better spot. Just kind of winging it here. If I find it, I will share that with you. He says, I'm a house painter. I says, I'm a painter. Houses. I am a surveyor. I'm a pencil maker. I am a gardener. I am a fence fixer. All these different things. He kind of gives him a paragraph of what he's been up to. And so that's one of the things that he's called out for. You went to Harvard, and what is your profession? He says, well, I do a little bit of everything, but I only do enough to pay for the things that I actually need to get involved with. Otherwise, I have a life. He's sort of warning us, this material world, again, this transition into the material of an industrial of the 1840s, and all these products coming into Concord, and everybody with shiny objects saying, I gotta have this, I gotta have that. Everybody's gotta work sun up to sundown to pay for all these things. And so Henry's like, keep that at arm's length, or you're going to lose your life. You're going to wake up one day and say, did I even live, or did I just work my entire life and never even have a day to truly live? So that's where Henry is giving us a message that I think even still resonates today very much. When Henry's at the pond, he's not isolated, as I said. He's actually going to take a trip to Maine for a couple of weeks, actually, while he's in the middle of this, and he locks his desk at his cabin at the pond. He leaves the door open. He comes back to find shavings and all kinds of things of people that have come and hung out at his cabin. He's going to also be moving about all the time. And if Emerson invites him to dinner at his house, he goes over to Emerson's house. So people decry Henry as saying he was a hypocrite. He went to his mom's house for cookies. He went and got his laundry done by his sisters. Well, of course he did. That's how his life was. That's what he was normally used to. And so there was nothing. Henry never said to us, I will be completely isolated. Do not come for me. I'm going to live this austere life of complete isolation and this survival project. He is living a normal life while he's there. And if Emerson invites you to dinner, you go to Emerson's house on Sunday and you come back to your cabin. And you go see your family down the railroad tracks, which is where they lived at the time. And so part of this calling out of Henry recently in the last 10 years or so has been that he's a real hypocrite. He never was really doing what he was supposed to be doing at Walden's. And this is not what he told us he was going to be doing. And he goes into town one day to get his shoes fixed. And the local sheriff says, Henry, you haven't paid your poll tax in the last few years. And Henry says, I refuse to pay my poll tax. Every voting man had to pay $1.50 a year to vote. This kind of a riffraff out of voting. And we're on the verge of invading Mexico to take over Mexican territory. And this is effectively, this time period, these presidents, Polk, you've got Van Buren, Andrew Jackson. These are not our greatest presidents. And we're really just steamrolling across the country. We are taking the Cherokee and we're sending them out to death's fate out in the central part of the United States, the Trail of Tears. We're going to invade Mexico, and slavery is expanding. And Henry will not support a government that legally is supporting the expansion of slavery. We have the Compromise of 1850 and we have the Fugitive Slave Act. And the Fugitive Slave Act makes every single American responsible for returning human property to its owner. If you assist a formerly enslaved person who ends up in your town by feeding them and taking care of them, you're committing a federal crime. This is abhorrent to Henry. And Henry says, I refuse to even play in this game. Everybody else pays their tax, they just send their money to the government. The government does immoral things with this money. Maybe if we didn't pay this money to the government, we wouldn't have any resources to do these immoral things. And so the sheriff says, Henry, I'll pay your poll tax for you, don't worry about it. Henry says, don't you dare pay my poll tax for me. Not in my name. I refuse to pay it on principle. Henry, I gotta throw you in jail. Throw me in jail. Henry goes for his night in jail, which was just behind the old Middlesex Hotel in downtown Concord. And there is a stone marker there today that talks about the night that he spends in jail. We believe one of his aunts came with some money with a veil over her face. She's embarrassed, and she pays off the sheriff and says, here's the money that he owes. Please free him. The sheriff is has gone home for the day and says, I'm home for the night, and so is he. He's in jail for the night. I'll get him in the morning. So Henry spends his night in jail. One of the side stories, which is kind of a fable in town, is that Ralph Waldo Emerson comes out and says, Henry, what are you doing in there? And he says to Ralph Waldo, what are you doing out there? So this is where Henry will get inspired to write what will eventually become Civil Disobedience. On resistance to civil government is how he named it. It looks like his editor changed it to Civil Disobedience. Resistance to civil government is something we go through in the Civil War, and we think it's toned down to civil disobedience. But this will be a text that will be highly influential on everybody from Tolstoy to Gandhi to Martin Luther King Jr. to Eastern Europe coming out from under the Soviet era, in Denmark in World War II. This idea of civil disobedience is going to be historic, and Henry is kind of the progenitor of this idea. This is not passive resistance. Two different things. Martin Luther King Jr. engaged in passive resistance, which is sitting at the lunch counters, sitting in the whites-only waiting area, kind of challenging things. Civil disobedience can include eventually what Henry Thoreau will support in John Brown, which is going and taking the guns from the storehouse in Harper's Ferry and giving them to enslaved people, because Henry does get to the point, and a lot of people will say Henry is a pacifist. He's mostly a pacifist, but he understands that enslavement is this atrocity that is bloody and violent. And the logic is that only a bloody and violent atrocity is going to end slavery. There is no negotiation. That man I showed you, William Lloyd Garrison, in his magazine, he tried for 20 years to get people to be guilted into ending slavery, called moral suasion, that we could actually guilt Americans into realizing, geez, this is immoral and we should be changing this institution. Not going to happen. And so Henry will support John Brown. John Brown will end up coming to Concord and receiving thousands of dollars in donations and bringing him out to Kansas. And by 1855, the American Civil War actually starts probably 5 years prior to 1860 out in Kansas, where people are killing each other over whether or not Kansas should be free or slave. Different towns are having raids on each other, and some of John Brown's men actually killed people in cold blood who were pro-slavery. So that's the microphone. So this is the site of Henry's cabin down by the pond, and this is the reproduction. When Henry is done at the pond, he returns back to the Emerson house, and Emerson, being the public speaker, invites him to stay for an elongated time. And Emerson is out publicly speaking, traveling to Europe and other places. And so Henry becomes the man of Emerson's house, which is really interesting. This is a man who never pairs up with another human being, never has children, never has a wife, never has a partner, is kind of at arm's length of this whole thing. But he's living in Emerson's house with Emerson's wife and their children, the Emerson children. And he becomes kind of a stepfather to Emerson's children. And he becomes quite connected to Lydian, Emerson's wife. And one of the interesting sort of developments of the Transcendentalist era is Can you have a loving, non-physical, intimate relationship with somebody else who is not your spouse? Is it that threatening? Is there any box to check for that? Like, we don't have any tolerance for that. You don't want your wife having a very, very close relationship with them, and you don't want your husband having another very, very close relationship with a woman. But the Transcendentalists, as I said, the limits of love earlier, the Transcendentalists, Ralph Waldo Emerson has a very, very intellectually connected, dynamic, powerful love relationship with a young writer named Margaret Fuller, who's a proto-feminist, one of our early feminists who comes out, a brilliant, classically educated woman who comes and stays at the Emerson house. Lydian absolutely sees that she's bringing the best out of her husband. And although it's not always smooth, but for the most part, I really give a lot of credit to Lydian for seeing this and understanding that they're not having a physical relationship. They are partners working on the Dial magazine. Ralph Waldo will ask Margaret to be the editor of the Dial magazine. And then in reverse, when Henry Thoreau comes and lives here, this is like a step-husband to her. This is the man of the house. They are like brother and sister. He writes very loving letters to her, and her in return back and forth when they are apart. But really fascinating for the time, and pretty dynamic for this time, late 1840s. And so Emerson's kids start calling Henry Papa, and so they're writing letters to him saying, "You need to get home because your kids are calling Henry Papa," and things are starting to shift here. And but also the trust of Ralph Waldo to have this man live with his family in his house while he is gone for many months at a time is also profound. These relationships and the dynamic that people are kind of pushing against the status quo is really remarkable. Henry's A Week on the Concord and Merrimack will come out in 1849. As we get into the 1850s, Henry has a famous speech that he gives in Worcester, July 4th, 1854, and with all of this tension with the South building and the Fugitive Slave Act really teeming at this point, Henry has been involved in washing the feet in a Jesus-like scenario. One of his visitors comes and finds him washing the feet of a formerly enslaved man who's come up from down south and is seeking protection in Concord temporarily, has been barefoot his whole trip up from down south, and Henry is fixing his feet and washing his feet, and he's going to get him on a train to Fitchburg to go up to Vermont. This is where Concord becomes a major stop on the Underground Railroad, with bringing people through town all the time. These are federal crimes. Henry's participating in a federal crime, washing this man's feet. We have to think about this. So Henry's big thing that he comes upon in civil disobedience is, if a law is immoral, do you just follow it, or are we obliged to break it? This is the question he asks us. Do we take the risk? Do you put yourself? We are a government of the people, by the people, for the people. The government isn't running us. We run the government. If there's an unjust law, are we obliged to break it, or do we wait for it to change and then finally get to it, or are we just obliged to break it? And this is one of the questions that Henry brings that inspires Gandhi and Martin Luther King and others. Henry is so incensed on July 4th that people are blowing off fireworks and celebrating our freedom in America in 1854. The huge contradiction that 4 million of our Americans are enslaved and powerless and brutalized is an atrocity to Henry. He writes, "Nowadays, men wear a fool's cap and call it a liberty cap. I do not know, but there are some who, if they were tied to a whipping post and could get one hand free, would use it to ring the bells and fire the cannons to celebrate their liberty. So some of my townsmen took the liberty to ring and fire. That was the extent of their freedom. And when the sound of the bells died away, their liberty died away also. When the powder was all expended, their liberty went off with the smoke." I mean, when some part of us is not free, then all of us are truly not free. We can't just have only some people free here and some not. He goes on to write, this is a July 4th, 1854 lecture called Slavery in Massachusetts. "The law will never make men free. It is men who have got to make the law free. They are the lovers of law and order who observe the law when the government breaks it. And so these are the questions of the morality of our government and the governing institutions and how we make them up and how they are to change and need to change when they're doing things that are immoral. 1854 will be the year that Henry's book Walden will be published, Life in the Woods. This gets pretty good reviews, kind of middle of the road reviews, and sadly, Henry is really thought of as kind of this misfit most of his life. He's going to die in 1862 of his tuberculosis. Never sees any of the kind of fame and the attention that we give him today. There's a big resurgence in interest in Henry about 1900 to 1910. A lot of his work is re-examined and republished, and there's a huge resurgence then. There's also a huge resurgence just around World War II in the 40s. And then in the 60s, the anti-Vietnam war protesters and others, and people thinking about environmental issues, late 60s, early 70s, Henry is taken on again in full force, and a lot of people pay a lot of attention. He's kind of gone by the wayside too. I read him in the early 1980s in high school. This has gone off of the reading lists of kids in school. Henry is countering the status quo. And more books are being banned, and more ideas that are counter to just being a main, straight ahead citizen. And anything that's controversial now is sort of pushed off. Unfortunately, these book lists now for kids. But we keep Henry alive with the Thoreau Society, and we encourage the revisiting, because all these things about materialism and spirituality still absolutely apply today, and the environment. Here is John Brown. He comes to Concord twice, 1857 and 1859, right on the verge of the Civil War. He goes from clean shaven to being this kind of Old Testament prophet of doom. He really kind of just inhabits this idea that it is time for this bloody taking back of African American freedom. And he will be arrested and hung for trying to get a hold of the weapons from Harper's Ferry. But we get, and what I'm sort of decrying here as we kind of get toward the end of this, is that we have people. This is a woman, highly followed writer from the New Yorker in 2015, who writes, "But Thoreau did not live as he described, and no ethical principle is emptier than the one that does not apply to its author. The hypocrisy is not that Thoreau aspired to solitude and self-sufficiency, but kept going home for cookies and company. Like I told you, he never told us that he wasn't going to go home for cookies. She's reading into the fact that he had a little cabin on Walden Pond, that, he must be isolating himself, and how come he's not isolating himself? That's just the gap between aspiration and execution, plus the variability in our needs and moods from one moment to the next, eminently human experiences which, had Thoreau engaged with them, would have made for a far more interesting and useful book." I have to disagree. I think Walden's a fascinating look at a number of aspects of life at that time, and does improve from economy in that first chapter. It sort of opens up and blooms, as does Henry. The hypocrisy is that Thoreau lived a complicated life but pretended to live a simple one. Worse, he preached at others to live as he did not, while berating them for their own compromises and complexities. Not quite. This is some of the stuff that I'm showing up here to sort of back against. That these are preconceived notions that people have about Henry that are not being met, and so they call him out on things that were never really there to begin with. Henry's family does pretty well with the pencil business, and they go, this is 255 Main Street in Concord, still there today. And Henry dies. He lasts quite a while, sort of on his bed. He has visitors coming, and his sister's helping him get his affairs in order. There's a wonderful moment where his aunt says to him, "Henry, have you made peace with God?" And he said, "I didn't know we had a quarrel." So they say Henry was humorless, but he had very wry humor. When Henry dies of tuberculosis, 1862, Henry Thoreau kind of looks back and rereads all of his journals, and Henry's kind of revisiting the friendship that he had, lifelong friendship. And in his eulogy, he leaves some of these comments. "He chose to be rich by making his wants few and supplying them himself," which is true. He did not live a complicated life like Catherine Schultz said. He did not. He lived very simply. And when he was done with everything at the pond, he went back to his family's house, lived with his cats, his sister, the piano, his mom and dad on Main Street. Regular old life again. So what he tells us is that that was an experiment that I did. And I had more lives to live, and that's why I left it. So he didn't say he was going to do it forever. You know, he did it for 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days. And he was on to other things. There was somewhat military in his nature. That is true about Henry. He was pretty much a stalwart and very serious. Not to be subdued, always manly and able, but rarely tender, as if he did not feel himself except in opposition. He was contrarian and oppositional for sure. He was a speaker and actor of truth, born such, and was ever running into dramatic situations from this cause. So this is someone so principled, he could not see. He would anguish over the fish that he caught and the suffering that the fish went through. He pretty much was a vegetarian, but when we went to Emerson's house, they had roast beef, and he'd eat roast beef while he was there. But Emerson, so he's conflicted every moment where there was some bit of suffering or something where he is trying. There's no way of just kind of just smoothing it over and going, no, okay, we'll just pass that up. I won't really pay attention to that like a lot of us do for a lot of things in life. Henry's like, this poor fish. Do I really need to be eating this fish? I love eating fish, but this thing, I'm yanking it out of the water, and it's suffering. I'm creating suffering. He's almost monkish this way. He's like meditating on all of this. No truer American existed than Thoreau. Ralph Waldo Emerson. Emerson met Lincoln. Emerson, I cannot help counting it a fault in him that he had no ambition. Wanting this instead of engineering for all America, he was the captain of a huckleberry party. And I'll wrap this up by saying that even Ralph Waldo doesn't quite get Henry. It's a mistake to think that Henry had the ambition that Waldo says that he misses in him. This is not a man who is, as I said, he's on the outside looking in on this whole game. He's not about material wealth, he's not about credit, he's not about getting ahead, he's not about power. He's about living deliberately day to day. And up at the gravesite at Sleepy Hollow, lots of people bring pencils, leave pencils at his grave. Ralph Waldo writes, the country knows not yet, or in the least part, how great a son it has lost. And Henry was pretty cheerful right up until his death. I've never got over my surprise that I should not have been born into the most estimable place in all the world, and in the very nick of time, too. That's just a wonderful kind of perspective, 1856 from Henry. And so yes, Henry did have a sense of humor. This is that 1856 daguerreotype, and using a little bit of AI. Pretty remarkable. This freaks out the people at the Thoreau Society. They've never seen anything like this. So there you go. Henry played the flute. He liked to dance. His favorite tune was Tom Bowen. It was about a naval sailor, sacrifice of a naval sailor, and the whole thing. And he was so he did have his light side, but he was quite contrary a lot of times. But anyway, if anyone has any questions. No.
I would just like to make a comment.
Sure thing.
I was interested in your telling about the influence that he had on people around the world. My family is Danish, and my aunt and uncle had twin boys when the Nazis invaded Denmark. And my aunt would take them out in the baby carriage with flags on the carriage, defying the Nazis. Nothing ever happened, but it was a very strong thing to do.
Walter Harding, who founded the Thoreau Society in 1941, he was a professor at New York State University Geneseo, had commented that Denmark was particularly influenced by Henry.
I had never known that.
Yeah, I only learned that recently, actually. I do have some materials up here. If you join the Thoreau Society, we publish quarterly the Thoreau Society Bulletin. This is a number of articles based on all kinds of different content from professors and amateur writers from around the world. We do also have an email list here. If you'd like to just join my email, you'll get updates from us as to events that are happening in Concord and that kind of thing as well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thanks for coming out today.
Very interesting.